Amanda was a curious and spirited traveler who had always dreamt of exploring new cultures and visiting iconic landmarks around the world. Her latest adventure took her to a majestic royal palace, a symbol of pride and tradition in a distant country. The palace was famous not only for its grandeur, but also for its disciplined royal guards, stoic, immovable figures who were revered as much as they were respected. These guards were the embodiment of the country's honor, trained to remain unshaken no matter the provocation. It was a bright morning when Amanda found herself among a bustling crowd of tourists at the palace gates. Cameras clicked, chatter filled the air, and children pointed in awe at the guards standing motionless in their ceremonial uniforms. Amanda, ever the thrill-seeker, marveled at the scene, but her attention kept returning to the guards. Their unflinching stillness fascinated her, and she wondered just how far their discipline would go. As the crowd swirled around, taking photos and whispering, Amanda's thoughts took a mischievous turn. What would happen if someone tried to make one of these guards move? Surely, it would just be a bit of fun, she thought to herself. Her curiosity nudged her forward, closer to one of the guards, a tall and imposing figure whose presence seemed almost larger than life. Standing just a few feet away, Amanda noticed the deep black of his uniform and the ceremonial sword that gleamed by his side. The guard's face was set in stone, his eyes focused ahead as if the world around him did not exist. Amanda felt a mix of admiration and playfulness bubbling inside her. He's just doing his job, she thought, but the temptation to test the limits of his composure was too strong. Taking a deep breath, Amanda reached out and lightly tapped the guard on his shoulder. It was a gentle slap, playful, not intended to harm. For Amanda, it was a harmless gesture, a moment of spontaneity in her otherwise routine tour. She expected nothing more than a laugh or a shared moment of humor, but what followed left her frozen in shock. The crowd gasped audibly, their murmurs growing into a wave of disapproving whispers. The air felt heavy as if the palace itself disapproved of her actions. The guard remained still, his training unshaken, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Within moments, two other guards appeared, their faces equally unreadable but their movements purposeful. They approached Amanda without a word, their presence alone conveying the seriousness of the situation. Amanda tried to explain herself, her words tumbling out in a mix of nervous laughter and apologies. "I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The guards gestured for her to follow them, their silence making her heart pound harder. The crowd parted as Amanda was escorted away, leaving behind the bustling scene that had turned into a tense spectacle. As she was led toward an official building within the palace grounds, Amanda felt the weight of her actions settling in. What she had dismissed as a moment of playful curiosity now seemed like a terrible mistake. She had unintentionally crossed a boundary, and the consequences of her impulsive act were just beginning to unfold. Amanda sat nervously in a dimly lit room, her heart racing as the seriousness of the situation began to sink in. Two uniformed officers stood by the door, their expressions stern and unreadable. This was not what she had expected when she set out on her palace tour that morning. What started as a playful gesture had spiraled into something far beyond her control, and now she was facing consequences she couldn't fully grasp. The silence was heavy until a man in a formal suit entered the room. He introduced himself as an official from the royal court, his tone calm but firm. He began to explain the gravity of Amanda's actions, detailing the country's strict laws regarding the treatment of royal guards. Amanda listened intently, her palms sweating as she realized just how deeply she had offended their customs. "You may not understand," the official said, "but in our culture, the royal guards represent the dignity and honor of our nation. They are symbols of loyalty and respect, and any act that challenges their role is seen as an insult to the entire country." Amanda's face turned pale. She hadn't meant to offend anyone. It was a thoughtless act born out of curiosity. "I didn't know," she stammered. "I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. I thought it was just a small joke." The official's expression didn't soften. "Ignorance of our laws is not an excuse," he replied. "This is a matter of great importance here. The royal family expects all visitors to honor our traditions, and your actions have caused a significant disturbance." Amanda tried to explain herself further, her voice trembling. She talked about her love for exploring new cultures and how she had been fascinated by the guards' discipline. But with every word, she could see that her explanations were doing little to change the gravity of the situation. The official remained composed but unmoved, reiterating that her case would need to be reviewed by a court to determine the appropriate response. As Amanda sat there, guilt and fear began to gnaw at her. She thought back to the scene at the palace gates, the shocked faces of the onlookers, the stoic silence of the guard, and the swift arrival of the other guards who had escorted her away. What she had dismissed as a harmless moment of fun was now clearly a serious offense, and she was beginning to realize just how deeply she had misjudged the situation. A lawyer was brought in to advise Amanda, but even his words did little to ease her growing anxiety. He explained that this was a high-profile incident. The royal guards were highly respected, and any perceived insult to them was seen as an insult to the royal family itself. Given the public nature of her actions, the case had attracted significant attention, and there was little chance of the matter being dismissed quietly. Amanda's thoughts raced as she tried to process everything. She felt a mix of regret, confusion, and helplessness. How could such a small action lead to something so monumental? As the lawyer prepared her for what lay ahead, Amanda could only hope that her apologies and explanations would somehow make a difference. But deep down, she knew that she was about to face consequences far beyond anything she had ever imagined. The courtroom was a grand yet intimidating space, its high ceilings and intricate decorations giving it a sense of authority that made Amanda feel small and vulnerable. She sat at a wooden bench with her lawyer beside her, trying to steady her breathing. The room was filled with people, officials, journalists, and curious spectators, all eager to see the outcome of her case. The weight of their gazes pressed down on her, making her acutely aware of how serious her situation had become. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Amanda's heart thumped loudly in her chest as the trial began. The prosecutor rose to speak first, laying out the details of her actions with precision and formality. He emphasized the cultural significance of the royal guards, explaining that they were not just figures of discipline but symbols of national pride. Their role was deeply rooted in the country's history, and any perceived disrespect toward them was treated as a direct affront to the royal family and the nation. Amanda listened intently, her stomach churning with regret. She hadn't fully understood the magnitude of her actions until now. The prosecutor continued, pointing out that Amanda's act, though seemingly trivial to her, had caused public outrage and tarnished the dignity of the palace. His words were measured, but they carried a sharpness that made Amanda feel as though the entire courtroom was judging her. When it was her turn to speak, Amanda stood up nervously. Her hands trembled as she addressed the court, her voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone," she began, her eyes darting around the room. "I was fascinated by the guards' discipline, and I acted without thinking. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I am truly sorry for my actions." She paused, her voice cracking. "I have nothing but respect for this country and its traditions. I came here to learn about your culture, not to offend it. I deeply regret what I've done, and I promise it will never happen again." The courtroom remained silent as Amanda sat back down, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Her lawyer then stood to present her case, emphasizing her lack of malicious intent and her willingness to take responsibility for her actions. He argued that Amanda's ignorance of the cultural norms should be taken into consideration, urging the court to show leniency. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that this was not a simple matter. The prosecutor countered that ignorance was no excuse, and that Amanda's actions had sparked outrage across the nation. The judge listened carefully, his expression neutral but unreadable, as both sides presented their arguments. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was firm yet calm, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he delivered his verdict. This court recognizes the defendant's apology and her lack of malicious intent, he said. However, her actions have violated our laws and disrespected our traditions. Such behavior cannot be taken lightly. Amanda gripped the edge of the bench as the judge continued. The court sentences the defendant to 5 years in prison. The words echoed through the room, and Amanda's heart sank. She felt a wave of disbelief and despair wash over her as the reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Amanda barely heard them. She sat frozen in her seat, her mind reeling from the weight of the sentence. It felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had come to this country as a curious tourist, and now she was leaving the courtroom as a convicted offender. Her life had taken a turn she never could have imagined, and there was no way to undo what had been done. Amanda sat quietly in the back of the prison transport vehicle, staring out of the small barred window. The streets of the vibrant city she had once admired now blurred into a haze of colors and shapes. She could barely process what had happened. Just days ago, she was a carefree tourist exploring a foreign culture. Now she was heading to a place she had never imagined: prison. The weight of her sentence felt like a heavy chain pulling her down into an unfamiliar, frightening reality. The vehicle stopped in front of a large, imposing building surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire. Amanda's heart sank as she was escorted inside by 2 guards. The air inside the facility was cold and heavy, and every step she took echoed in the long, sterile hallways. She was led to a small room where her belongings were taken, and she was given a plain uniform to wear. The gravity of her situation was undeniable now. This was her new life, at least for the foreseeable future. Her cell was small and simple, with a hard bed, a tiny table, and a single window that let in a sliver of light. Amanda sat on the bed, feeling the walls close in around her. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment the judge had delivered her sentence. 5 years. 5 years in a foreign prison for a mistake she had made in a single thoughtless moment. The thought was overwhelming, and tears began to stream down her face. The days that followed were a blur of routine and silence. Amanda struggled to adjust to the strict rules and the unfamiliar environment. She kept to herself, too nervous to speak to the other inmates. The language barrier made things even harder. She couldn't understand most of what was being said around her, leaving her feeling isolated and disconnected. Meals were eaten in silence, and the hours dragged on endlessly. Amanda spent most of her time in her cell, replaying the events that had led her here and wondering how she could ever move forward. Despite the challenges, Amanda began to notice small moments of kindness that helped her cope. One of the guards, an older woman with a gentle demeanor, occasionally offered her a warm smile or a kind word in English. Another inmate, who seemed to sense Amanda's discomfort, quietly left an extra blanket on her bed one chilly evening. These gestures, though small, gave Amanda a glimmer of hope and reminded her that even in the darkest places, compassion could be found. As the weeks turned into months, Amanda started to adapt. She spent time reading books from the prison library, some in English and others that helped her learn the local language. She began to understand the culture more deeply, realizing the importance of the traditions she had so thoughtlessly disrespected. This knowledge gave her a new perspective, and she started to reflect on her actions with a greater sense of humility. Amanda's days were no longer just about survival. She started to find meaning in small tasks and interactions, learning to appreciate moments of peace and connection. Her regret for her mistake remained, but it was now accompanied by a determination to grow from the experience. Amanda began to write letters to her family back home, sharing her thoughts and expressing her gratitude for their support. It was a way to stay connected to the outside world and remind herself of the life waiting for her beyond these walls. Though her sentence loomed large, Amanda slowly realized that this chapter of her life didn't have to define her entirely. It was a painful lesson, but it was also a chance to change, to grow, and to emerge stronger than before. Months turned into over a year, and Amanda began to find a sense of stability within the rigid walls of the prison. Though life was far from easy, she had learned to adapt and even grow during her time there. She spent much of her days reflecting on her actions and writing in a small journal she had been allowed to keep. Each entry was filled with thoughts of remorse, lessons she had learned, and hopes for the future. One day, during her usual work assignment in the prison library, Amanda was called to the warden's office. Her heart raced as she followed a guard through the long corridors. She had no idea what to expect, but her thoughts ranged from fear to cautious optimism. When she entered the office, she was surprised to see not just the warden, but also a representative from her home country's embassy. The representative greeted Amanda warmly, explaining that her case had received significant attention internationally. Advocacy groups and her government had been working behind the scenes to negotiate with the royal court for leniency. The representative went on to say that her behavior in prison, her quiet compliance, efforts to learn the language, and expressions of genuine remorse had been noted and had played a key role in softening opinions toward her. Amanda listened in stunned silence as the representative continued. After much negotiation and consideration by the royal court, her sentence was being reduced. She would be released early for good behavior and allowed to return home. Relief flooded over her, and tears filled her eyes as she thanked the representative and the warden, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. Her release day came quicker than she could have imagined. Amanda stood at the gates of the prison, wearing the clothes she had arrived in, now slightly worn, but a reminder of how far she had come. The older guard who had shown her kindness offered a small smile and a quiet good luck in English. Amanda nodded, her voice caught in her throat, and stepped outside into the bright sunlight. The journey home felt surreal. Amanda looked out of the plane window as the familiar sights of her home country came into view, her emotions a whirlwind of joy, relief, and lingering guilt. She thought about the country she had just left, the culture she had unintentionally disrespected, and the people who had taught her lessons she would carry for the rest of her life. Once back home, Amanda found herself in the center of attention. News outlets wanted interviews, and people were curious about her experience. But Amanda chose to keep a low profile, focusing instead on sharing her story in a way that could make a difference. She wrote an open letter, which was published in a popular magazine, detailing her journey and the importance of understanding and respecting other cultures when traveling. In her letter, she apologized once again for her actions and shared what she had learned about humility, responsibility, and the value of cultural awareness. She urged others to approach new experiences with curiosity, but also with respect and mindfulness. Her story became a cautionary tale that inspired travelers to educate themselves before exploring the world. Amanda's life gradually returned to normal, but she was forever changed by her time in that foreign prison. The experience had been humbling and challenging, but it had also taught her resilience and the power of personal growth. Though she would always regret the mistake that led her there, Amanda chose to use her experience to create a positive impact, proving that even in the face of hardship, transformation and redemption are possible.